I've shown you how to set up your Monstera for success, but people are constantly DMing me about the exact same plant. And that's this one, you know, arms out like a T, crawling across the floor, refusing to grow upwards. So I bought one. Just kidding, I bought two. The biggest issue people have with this plant is that it's growing in two separate directions instead of growing upwards. Once your plant gets to this point, it's very difficult to stake the plant so you can tie it to a piece of wood or a moss pole. I guess you could just take the two ends of the stems, crank them up like this and tie them together, but number one, this doesn't look very good. And number two, if your stem is actually thick enough, you are in danger of just snapping it in half. So how do you fix this? Easy. I'll show you two different ways. You need to take top cuttings from your plant. I suggest counting 1, 2, 3, 4 of your newest leaves on a vine and cutting below that aerial root. Once you do that, you can cut off some of your lower foliage, so this means cutting off the petioles. In my experience, top cuttings with 2 to 3 leaves are generally the best for rooting. It does depend on how big your leaves are and how many roots you already have, so try to strike a good balance. If you're rooting your plant in water with less foliage and more roots, it will root a lot faster. I do like to treat the ends of my stem in sulfur, which is an antifungal, but the most important thing is that you're using clean tools that are disinfected with rubbing alcohol. Now the bottom part of your plant that is left over will regrow, but I'm going to choose to give this one away because everyone wants a Monstera, right? While we wait for these cuttings to dry, let's check out our second option, separating and rearranging these plants. I think people keep asking about this one because they're afraid to cut their plant, but hopefully you'll see that cutting your plant will look way better when everything is said and done. So preparing your plant is always kind of a pain. This entire process of separating this plant took around 15 to 20 minutes. I would consider this an easy plant to separate. When they're straight from the store, usually they haven't been in a pot long enough for the roots to get so tangled and intertwined. I have, however, heard insane stories of this taking several hours over multiple days to untangle some roots. So consider this. If you've had your plant for several years and it's been healthy in a large pot, accept that this is going to be a huge amount of work. Anyway, use gloves and you can get a chopstick to help loosen the soil and the roots. They usually make the job go a lot faster. After most of the soil was gone, you can start ripping the plant apart and sort them out by large cuttings and small cuttings. I personally think that 2 to 3 cuttings in a large pot looks the best, so I'm taking 3 of the largest cuttings and sticking them together. The small cuttings I'm just going to pot up and give them away because everyone likes a Monstera, right? Now that my stake is in, I have to fill up the pot with a bit of soil. I'm using a mix of potting soil, cactus soil, orchid bark, and horticultural charcoal. Normally, I recommend just using potting soil, perlite, and orchid bark as a basic mix. But as long as your plant is getting a lot of light and you have an appropriate pot size, you can really get away with any basic potting soil that you like. After putting in the cuttings with the part of the stem that has the aerial roots facing the climbing pole, I generally like to tie some of it up just to make getting the soil in a little bit easier. That way the plant isn't shifting around so much. Then you can fill in the rest of it with soil and tie the rest of it. So it's been a little bit. Let's see how the root development is actually going. Probably somewhere between mediocre and pretty good. The root growth is pretty healthy and it's good enough to be potted up. I'm just going to trim a few sections like right here where it looks like the root might start to be dying off a little bit. One of the other challenges with water propagation is that when you have the plant in water for too long, when it does start growing leaves, it's very likely that they're going to be significantly smaller than the previous growth. So making sure it gets as much light and heat as possible so that it produces roots more quickly is going to be really beneficial for the plant. When you're propagating such a long cutting, you're likely going to run into this problem. Having so many aerial roots rooted, you're not going to have enough room to fit all of this in the pot. I can only get to about here, which means that all the roots from this node and this node are likely going to dry off. Of all these roots, decide which ones are worth keeping. I think these ones up here are looking a little bit better than these, so don't be afraid to just slice them off. Now we have space to fit everything in. And remember, you can pot these up and they will root and grow new leaves. Here's a growing eye right here, and here's another one right here. The newest leaf will come from these points. I have this leaf that's planted so deeply in the soil, so I'm actually going to remove this. This one's going to be in a little bit of danger too, but we'll see how it's actually planted once I get the second stem in. This is what the plants look like immediately after repot, and yeah, they kind of look like crap, but actually that's pretty normal, especially consider that the plants were outside of their mediums for a longer period of time with exposed roots on relatively warm days. You also should know that the plant that was water propagated, that's the one with the birch bark pole, it's 2 full months behind on growth in soil. That's something really important to keep in mind. Let's fast forward. Now, at the start of this video, I did say that cutting your plant will look way better than rearranging. So you might assume that I was wrong because I'm trying to convince you that this plant actually looks better than this plant, but you really have to look a little bit closer. When you rearrange your stems, especially on a longer plant, a lot of the older leaves are more likely to have suffered damage and are more likely to fall off early. So something you can expect to see is huge portions of missing foliage or foliage that you'd honestly rather cut off to make your plant look a little bit nicer. Now, while I always encourage people to leave their leaves on their plant until they're yellow and dried out like this because number 1, the plant reabsorbs the nutrients as the leaf is dying, and 2, removing leaves only makes your plant grow slower. I never shame someone for cutting off leaves before it's time because it's a decorative plant and it has one job, and that's to look good. On a water propagated plant, you'll end up keeping more foliage because you only kept the best 2 to 3 leaves in the first place. Fast forward again, and one of the most obvious things is that when you rearrange your plant, it continues to grow at the same size almost immediately. Generally more fenestrations or larger leaves right away. So if you're an impatient person, this is probably something that you're going to like. Cutting the plant to water propagate generally slows down growth and can potentially have the plants produce smaller leaves while in water. Not always, but it's more than likely. But I don't know, something just kind of feels off about this plant. Maybe I should have only gone with 2 stems, but personally I prefer the look of the water propagated plant. I think it looks more balanced, generally has healthier leaves overall, and in the next 2 months I'm sure it will look even better with some larger leaves. I polled my friends and most of them have said that this looks worse and this looks better. But again, personal preference, and both methods can clearly produce some great looking plants. But let me know in the comments which one you think looks better, and if you like this video, then you'll probably like this one too.